Do the two of you want to come up here? What's this dinging? No, I like this. So, you tell me something.
So we can go till 1 o'clock, that gives us half an hour.
Okay, so we just, that's okay. Just fine. A little bit. So, the interdisciplinary conversations like this one are interesting because, of course, we approach conferences and we approach moderation and we approach facilitation depending on our disciplines in very different ways. And so if I was in a planning kind of conversation, the facilitation and comments would be very different. And this one affords me, I think, a different kind of space, and I appreciate that very much. So I want to start actually by thanking our two presenters. I mean, we went sort of into a deep dive into Mumbai, so it's very place-based, right? And to sort of quote what you in your paper, what you talked about, Aparna, about working in the grain. So for me, it's sort of in a sense, it's not just working in the grain in terms of the theoretical frameworks that either of you was using, but also in terms of a place-based sort of engagement, which is really interesting to have. To have place bound the conversation in a particular sort of manner. And so you're both looking at water, whether it's about where the ocean meets the land or where the clouds burst and and clogged waterways lead to flooding. And so so there's water and there's Mumbai. Now, there's many different ways in which we can start to approach these questions, but thinking also about the rest of what we've been hearing today and yesterday, I wanted to focus on one piece and then open it up, of course, for questions. So I want to talk a little bit more about method that I think is coming up again and again and again, right? I can't remember who it was, maybe it was Sonal who said, the social scientific determinism is just like, don't want to get into that. And here I am standing someone who is sitting much more in the social sciences than in the humanities per se, who engages questions of technology and legality and making all the time, and then trying to think through what the sort of humanistic interpretive acts allow us to do in that other mode, right? And so sort of want to kind of make my positionality clear at some level, and I have a couple of slides because, like Rohit, I think in image and text and in making all the time, which I think is where people like Rohit, myself, Rupali, the architects in the room, really differ from some of the folks who sit squarely, and much more like the artists maybe, but sit squarely in the interpretive sort of modalities. So this question, going back to this question of method, we've heard, we've heard about the oral history, we've heard about the ethnography, we've heard about fieldwork, we've heard about the semi-structured interview, the dreaded one, right? But what's fascinating for me is the ways in which we're not talking about the appropriateness of, we are talking about it, but we struggle so much with what is appropriate as a method. And we struggle so much with thinking about that, and we're trying to figure out whether there's something particularly South Asian about both method and theory, whether there's something particular about place that leads to us needing to think about particular kinds of methods. So for me, this session kind of opened up those questions in so many different ways, right? Is a method a diagnostic, as it is for Aparna with the mangrove? Is a method truly just about it's not just a diagnostic, but a way to generate knowledge? And then this question always about whether we're talking about expert knowledge or whether we're talking about everyday knowledge, everyday lived experience and that sort of knowledge, and how those two come then into conversation with each other. For someone like Rohit, and I think it comes out in Rohit's paper, or for someone like someone like me, an architect, or someone who's actually engaged in policy making, dare I say. The question of that socio-spatial vocabulary and the question of practice becomes quite central. So method then is also a practice that goes beyond just being something about a diagnostic or a way to generate knowledge. It also becomes about making new futures. And then if you're going to talk about method in those ways, the pedagogical question, I think Rupali called herself a pedagogue, which was like, demagogues, no. But whatever, I mean, that, the pedagogical question of what we're doing with these methods becomes quite important. So I think those were some of the questions that I wanted to place before us here. And then to think about some of the modalities by which we're doing the work. So there's imagery, of course, but in Rohit's work, there was very deliberate use, right, of the plan and of the axonometric. And of particular kind, for those of you who are familiar with these kinds of sort of visual imaginaries, right? Corbusier's 6-foot-high man appearing, very modernist. Certain kinds of ways of thinking about plan and elevation, right? The ubiquitous blue plastic of Mumbai, right? Which the artist whose name I was asking Rupali for, Kulavur, I think, right? What's his name? Who does these amazing prints, quotes what's Mr. Ambani's house in blue plastic, and then all these very fascinating ways of thinking about. So there's color, there's ways of representation, there's all kinds of hints and ways to think about narrative, which then open up again this question of vocabularies, of how we want to capture what's happening. Now, I'm kind of stretching myself here to a point where I hope you'll forgive me. But when I read Aparna's paper, I kept going back to the fact that people like me, we raid, we plunder, we take whatever we want from whichever discipline, because that's what architects do. And we just take what we want, and we don't actually think too much about the rationality by which we take, and whether there has to be a certain kind of rigor and framing, which is what the disciplines do, right? You can't just take from one place and take to another and take with just because it fits your way of looking at things. And but in the making disciplines, we do that, and we do it with absolute abandon. Parasmita, I was not here for your paper, but I wish I had been, because I can't see you, wherever you are, yeah, because you used this wonderful phrase at the end where you said, in a delinquent manner, and I was like, that makes so much sense to me, to take with impunity. So that, though, has been coming back to me in the papers I'm listening to at this conference, but it really came back in Aparna's paper, with this issue of reciprocal translation, where you ask a question in Marathi, you convert it to English, the English gets converted to Marathi, and then it gets converted back to English, and you go back and forth, till at some arbitrary point in time, it feels like, forgive me for saying that, you decide to stop. Where suddenly then the mangrove becomes clammy and wet, but you've decided to stop at some point. So for me, this question of method and this question of theorizing is so kind of caught up in our own positionalities of where we decide to stop. And how do we then think about where, right? So in reciprocal translation that you talk about, how do you decide to make that cut and where do you stop? For Rohit, it's like, how do you decide what kind of drawing and where you're going to stop, and why would it be the postcard, and so on and so forth. So those are sort of questions that keep coming back to me quite a bit. And I think it speaks to this other conversation that we're having about South Asian theorizing, right? Or this conversation that has just started. Do we create a glossary? Do we create a set of methods? Do we root it in place? And do we say there's something special about this place, connected in different kinds of ways in that conversation about the Himalayas or about the ocean, that allows us to think about it in certain ways? Two things kept popping up. Again, in these two papers, as well as in this, in the conference. One is, of course, of relationality. We keep bringing up this issue of what relates to what and how. And therefore, if you're going to look at, I think Mona yesterday was talking a lot about, you have to think of the political context. If you don't contextualize what you're talking about in the politics of it, it doesn't make any sense. There are, and then we're talking about multilinguality. We're talking about using frameworks generated, say, on the border of Mexico and the United States, and using that framework to think about mangroves and Mumbai. So for me, when that's another kind of piece where the taking, the borrowing doesn't sit well with me sometimes, because I cannot understand the logic which is then governing how that borrowing begins to happen. And so I get the sense that I'm losing all of you at some. Okay, Iftikhar says I'm not losing him, so he's going to be my lodestar there. So if you'll give me one more minute, when Rohit sent me slides this morning, I added some of mine because I wanted to think through a little bit more about this relationality question. Some years ago, some of you know that I work in the Nilgiris and I've been doing so for about the last 13 years. So when thinking along the grain in the Nilgiris, I think a lot from that, within that context. And Rohit and I are in sort of a conversation, and I think Aparna, you with the forest question, the mangroves question, there too as well. Where's the view thing on this? There it is.
Recording in progress.
Back again. And so many years ago, I happened to bump in this sort of very, crazy way that we have of working, those of us who make, into the work of Glissant. And I bumped into it through the film One World in Relation. I don't know if you guys have, if any of you have seen it, Mantaya Diawara's film, which is a kind of a long conversation with Glissant. And that film is quite fascinating, right? Because it talks about creolization as opposed to borderlands. It doesn't theorize a zone of contact. It doesn't close off places. And it's really, and that particular film, and then later reading of the work that we did, was so much about how you don't, as the other, remain separate from the ways in which there's this, whoever you're thinking about in conversation with, but you look also at simultaneous changes that are happening. And so that began to inform, I think, the work that we were doing in the Nilgiris in interesting ways, which is it's a bilingual program. It's taught in Tamil and English. It's what we call in Cornell language, Cornell speak engaged research. Some of you might call it participatory teaching. I think there's a lot of pedagogical connections to the way people at sea work. It brings expertise into conversation with expertise into conversation with everyday knowledge. And one of the things we do is, and we bring Adivasi students together with Cornell students, and they spend 15 weeks together in this program. 7 weeks they sit in the classroom and learn, and 7 weeks they do research together and then come up with some kind of making. So for me, what's really interesting about this relational sort of quality to things is this recording and mapping that we do with the communities that we work with. And of course, it's multilingual. There are more than 10 languages in that classroom, but we've narrowed it down to 2, Tamil and English. And so in doing so, and in setting up our pedagogical practice, we connect that back then to thinking about other ways of generating knowledge, other forms of diagnosis. And I use these diagrams because these drawings, because I want to sort of raise, I think, a question for me, which is, even in that very form of drawing, you bring a certain level of expertise into the conversation, right? You bring a certain level of distance into the conversation. And then in giving back, right, through that form of postcard or through however you're thinking about it, how does that begin to happen? What results does that really begin to have? The other part that's so fascinating for me in the work that we do in the Nilgiris is how my Adivasi students, community students we call them, or the Cornell students, how much they are like each other. How colonized all of them are, right? All of us are. How we all, even in our representations, share something which is not rooted in some deep indigeneity or something. So it's not, I don't like the word romanticization because I think it actually takes away the very deep hybridity in the ways in which all these identities and pieces are constructed. And so when we start to say there is an indigenous way of knowing that is separate from everything else that's happening, it troubles me because in my practice, when I ask people to draw landscapes, or when we together draw a landscape, this is, could you tell who's, so this is the landscape that my Adivasi students are drawing. It has a lot of detail in it, right? That you can really look at and say, they know about the animals and the fields are all planted and the boats are drawn in great detail and the fish, they will tell you, some of them will know the various species, some of them won't. And then of course my Cornell students, right, are also doing something which in some ways doesn't look that different in terms of in terms of the way it uses drawing, and in some ways it doesn't look that different in terms of how they're actually representing what they're doing. So I'm going to stop there. This is not a presentation about my work, but what I do want to point out though is the difficulties I have with this conversation that we're having. Where we slide and slip between thinking about romanticization and not. We slide and slip between valorizing some kinds of ways of representation and not. We make decisions on what is valid or not in completely opaque ways. And then I keep going back to Mona's paper yesterday. We are so critical of another person who has done the same thing as us. And so I'm thinking of what's his name, Nikhil?
Nilesh.
Nilesh. We've forgotten his name. But he's doing something very similar, right? You can say, okay, there should be a politics to contextualize the conversation, but it leaves me troubled, and it leaves me troubled in these two papers as well. Because I think this question of method and this question of interpretation is too reliant on a set of conversations that are too much deeply rooted in the individual. I mean, Glissant talks about, don't look at the tree, look at the forest. What's the collective? So not the, forgive me for sort of challenging you, Nida, but not maybe the idiosyncratic norm, but that collective public space, or not, right? So that's my challenge, I think, to all of us, and to the two of you, in thinking about the way you structure your papers and your work. Thank you.
Thank you so much, and thanks also to Rohit. I think there's a lot more conversation we're going to have beyond this as well, but I don't think I need to think more if I want to respond to all parts of the questions, but I think just in terms of like where do you stop the interpretation, I think part of it is a pragmatic kind of decision about, you are the one writing the paper and kind of embracing that and accepting that somewhat power dynamic because it's going to be there. But also, I think there's a degree of saturation. Some of this is based on like a long time of field work. And, when you hear the same thing over and over again, there's a saturation point where you realize that, okay, this is definitely something that resonates. And so it becomes, I think, a relevant way of framing a stopping point for interpretation, because otherwise it just becomes an endless process. So I think thinking about like what resonates, what you hear collectively across a lot of people, for me becomes a frame to think about. It's not so much to stop the analysis, but to think about what appears to be most relevant for a large number of people. The other thing is about borrowing theory. I guess isn't that the point of theory? I'm definitely very skeptical of universalization of theory, but I guess the point of theory is to move from the specific to a slightly broader understanding of something. And so if we can read and find resonances between places, for me, that's the most productive use of theory. So it's not to contextualize it, but to see how to reapply it in a different context. And sometimes it doesn't stick, and sometimes it does. So I guess I I don't know, I guess that's how I see theory. Sorry, Mabel. But I remember like reading Mabel's paper for a different, not this one, but a different one. And I think there was like a lot of conversation amongst us about like the fear about universalizing. But I think in that process, a lot of us also had a fear of making any kind of generalizable statements. But I see that as kind of the point of theory and kind of theory coming from the global south, where we can make arguments that restructure our understanding of more dominant theories. So yeah, I guess I personally don't worry too much about borrowing theory. I am more interested in thinking about how we can make connections across places through the kind of knowledge is produced in a grounded manner without assuming that they will fully apply. And I'm also a kind of disciplinary wanderer. I mean, I'm trained as an architect and very much think about the process of making and kind of have come to realize that making can be thought about in a more capacious sense. And like certainly a lot of my other work kind of looks at drawing and the making of drawing and what it means to draw, but I guess I don't have a specific response about the relation of making with theory building. To me, that's an open-ended question and something that we can think about through the process of interpretation about what we learn from one method and way of doing, like what kind of muscles we are applying to do one type of work and another type of work, and think about ways of doing some level of interpretation and movement between the two. But that's not a very specific response, and I need to think more about that.
My questions were so unspecific, but I think you did. You started the conversation in a wonderful way, Rohit, and then we open it up. I see. Okay.
Thanks, Neema, for those, for that extended conversation with the work. But also, I see in your kind of comments two kinds of questions. It is a question of the method of doing the field work, but also of the narrative form. So I kind of speak about them, two different things. So on the slide where I had posed the question, there were two images in the background. These were images of the fact-finding committee reports following the 2005 floods, one by the state, the other by the civil society. Now, I didn't discuss about them, but what happens in both those reports is both reports identify several kinds of problems as to why this flooding is taking place. And the sources of blame overlap but are also different. But what's common across both of them is that you see, and where they kind of come together, is that one criminalizes certain kinds of settlements and the inhabitants in them, and the other makes them into hapless victims. Now, those of us who have lived in Bombay for a very long time, and my childhood has been in a place where I've kind of lived in housing which has experienced floods. There are many things happen beyond being either encroachers, criminalized, or hapless victims. Many other kinds of stories that unfold beyond apocalyptic narratives, dispossession, so on and so forth. I wanted to capture these stories and the voices from which these stories were emanating, because there's completely a lack of when I started this work in late 2019 or early 2020, I found there to be a lack of work on looking at households and the narratives that are emerging from them. The social science focus on urbanization and ecological change was captured by a focus on the rise of the new middle class in civil society. In that, I wanted to move away from that. And that's where the household becomes both the interlocutor, but also a kind of, a locus of division of responsibilities, but also sense of things. So that's what I wanted to focus on. That's the first thing. The second thing that I wanted to kind of draw attention to here is of the question of the narrative form, which both Rupali and Kajri have kind of pointed out too. And so the first set of drawings that you saw are a part of a graphic novel that is kind of built up, coming up, and the other ones, postcards, have a different story to it. I'll just speak about the graphic novel, and then we'll kind of open it up for discussion. I've worked as an architect and as a planner, both are my kind of professional training. And working with colleagues across several kinds of projects, I've come to realize, or collectively we've come to realize, that the work that we do and the point that we want to drive across gets appropriated in some other way when it takes on the form of a conventional report. It can be used in ways that you don't want it to be used. So how does one avoid that? For instance, when I presented this graphic novel in a workshop organized by the Municipal Corporation on stormwater drainage, some of the planners and the consultants of the Climate Action Plan asked me, so can you tell us how much compensation needs to be given to people who are facing this challenge? And that's where they miss on to the point of the spatial form itself and spatial affordances that are produced by the inhabitation. It's the drawings and the spatial form that has to be looked at more carefully than reducing it to the question of compensation itself. Which is why not the written report, but also the graphic novel and not a comic book, because there are several works on climate change emerging as comic books. They become reductive in that sense.
Deeply. Thank you so much. Because I think both your responses were about sort of this question of contextualization and politics, right? And therefore, that kind of contextualization, which both of you were doing, is about then the kind of perspective and view one picks up on, and therefore then what frameworks become salient. I saw 4 hands. If Pikar, you'll go last. Yourself, there was someone, Anu over here, and there was somebody else right over there. Ezra. So 3 people, please.
Yeah, thank you for 2 great presentations. So I will try to be coherent and also tag on to this theory debate, because I think there's also what you're saying, Aparna, is it relates also to this, at least in anthropology, there's been this thing that women do case studies and men do theory. So I think it is important to go beyond the case study and theorize in that sense. But I wanted to ask you if you could maybe tell us more about why seeing like a man grow, and also how that relates to borderlands. It wasn't completely clear to me. And then in terms of representation and so on, like as an anthropologist, we do kind of look to individuals and try to, go beyond seeing it as anecdotes. But I'm still curious as to who did you speak to that saw these mangroves as encroachments, and who described them as intruders, or that they're difficult to be in, or that they're aesthetically unpleasing. It was very new to me to hear mangroves described in that way, so I was curious to who they are that are saying that. And to Rohit, I was really curious about the ways floods are used in Mumbai. Is there any local word for floods? Because floods is very like British, and I'll talk about that tomorrow, so that it has this negative connotation, right? But if we live in wetness, as there's been a way of dealing with these seasonal inundations, have there been other words? Is the use of floods here, is it related to like lack of drainage or like waterlogging? Is it related to like infrastructural developments, or is it just that the rain is falling too much? It wasn't clear to me. That was my thinking.
Let's take 4 or 5 questions, because I'm also aware that we only have 3 minutes left, so at least you have a sense of people's responses. So, Ezra, Anu.
We can take a few minutes.
Okay, but Ezra, Anu, and Lalita. Anu, were you going first?
Maybe my question will be quick. Thank you for these presentations. So I've been thinking a lot about infrastructure. And just building on Rupali's point this morning about thinking about maybe key terms that we draw. I couldn't help but think about infrastructures with both of your presentations in different ways. I'm also really thinking about not just actual physical infrastructures, but the ways in which they help us re-narrate. Again, thinking about Sonal's point about long processes of myth-making that we're intervening in. So, Rohit, you ended by talking about these mirrors that happen with the territories that you're talking about, and this is one of the significant ways I think about infrastructure, that infrastructure is a thing that is supposed to bind, but then it also oppresses. It is the very site of anti-colonial resistance. And yet, if you think of a mangrove as the new infrastructure, this helps us re-narrate ways in which infrastructures have been oppressive and yet can be rethought in new terrain. I wonder if this is a key concept that we might think about and reinvent in this context, or whether it is just a colonial term that we put to rest. Some of these threshold terms I've been thinking about in the last day.
Thank you. So my suggestion will be to take all the questions and perhaps not answer them. So it's better to have.
Sure, let's do that with lots of questions. I see.
I think it will raise.
Let's take all the questions, and I think it's wonderful that the two papers have produced so much. Right? Yeah.
Well, that goes against my expectations.
Yes, we can have conversations at lunch.
My questions, two questions for Rohit, but I would like to thank you so much for all the work you're doing in this presentation. I mean, it was such a powerful way of demonstrating how residence suburbs prime as a norm, that's what we assume to be superior. So, I took Neema's questions as an invitation for giving you more space to tell us why you made those decisions, because of course we have to make decisions about our ways of representing, our methods of learning. It's unavoidable. So in that spirit, I wanted to hear more about something you said while representing the first project. You said, I'm not going to show photographs, I'm only going to show axonometric drawings. And I want to hear, because there must be so much thinking there that is not fit into the 20-minute presentation. And I want to hear why you chose that. And it's a technical drawing. Maybe it's not that communicatable to maybe non-architects, non-experts, but you must have made that decision for some reason. And I wanted to hear that as a self-reflection and space for telling us your decisions. But my second question is, sorry, Neema, this will be about concepts. And I'm thinking of this distinction between climate adaptation and climate mitigation as two different concepts. By adaptation, I mean the things that you showed, but in a way, it accepts climate change as is and tries to build resilience and tries to record how people adapt to climate change. Whereas by mitigation, I mean the institutions regulating the necessary steps so that there is no further climate change. So your scholarship, I think, really gives us clues about how people find their tactics of adapting. But I wonder if we stop there, we are also letting the institutions, the responsible institutions who should be doing the climate mitigation work, let them go too easily because we valorize so much the resilience and adaptation and so on, but there should be also responsible institutions that should learn from that and do something to also mitigate. So I was wondering how you anticipate the responsible institutions taking their work and do something about it, not just rely on the people's tactics, like everyday people's tactics to adapt to climate change.
Thank you so much, Ezra. No, you're done. Okay. There was another couple of hands. Very soon.
So Rohit, I was just very intrigued by the last comment you made when you said you chose to work on a graphic novel and not a comic book, right? So I'd love to hear about how the decision.
Okay, we have one last comment, question before we disappear for lunch and you can have individual conversations with Rohit and Aparna. Ithaca. Oh, got it.
I mean, Neema, your comments, you start off by saying that architects and yourself are free to kind of plunder the word, okay? But then, but then in some sense, but then you also level the accusation on the analyst or theorist, okay? So, which is of course fine. I think it's a provocative statement and a call for reflection. But I think you can only begin from, the question is you can only begin from what resonates with you. In that sense, I agree with that, and I think the question of Southern pluralism is an important one because, we are all or many of us, or most of us are trying to see ways to think about, analysis, representation, etc., in ways that don't, aware of kind of the power dynamics that have shaped the world for the last, kind of decades and centuries. So that's very much, in a sense. And the other thing about, I'm an art historian, and the question of the individual versus the community, that question. In some sense, I don't see them as necessarily in opposition if it's done right? So, in other words, this is also leads back to Neema's presentation where we, talked about how there were these two individuals and their private gardens, but nevertheless, one of them at least is also an activist, right? So that relation between a kind of an exemplary or an experiment and its relation to the wider collective is not one that will be reduced to a binary.
And may I have the last
word?
Okay. And moderator. So, thank you for wrapping it all back in, because I was talking from both sides of the mouth, right? And I do think you're all right. And it does for me come back to this relational question. Because even when you say, these two individuals, but one's an activist, I look at something, till it resonates. There's always a kind of a conditionality, a relational aspect to how those decisions are being made. And it seems to me that it behooves us, as we think about Southern theorizing, as we think about glossaries, as we think about how we want to represent things, as we think about how we want to represent things to institutions, so many forms, right? I'm sure you've seen, what's her name, Madeline Stratton's wonderful essay about bullet points, for example. Right? And so there are so many forms of presenting materials and writing, but I don't find us paying enough attention to those questions. Not always. And so it's just a comment and a call to really think through those pieces, as opposed to leaving it to it resonates. To Mr. Nilesh Oak. It resonates with him as well, right? And so I think that's the piece for me. It leaves me very uncomfortable because the kinds of frameworks we're all using translate over. I don't know. Looking at all of you to give me wisdom. But for now, I think it's all about lunch and further conversations.
Just for a quick point.
Sure.
This is a little bit just inspired by the conversation, a little bit more discomfort or restoring all other discomforts. I think the fidelity or appropriateness question maybe sidesteps situational questions. So Mona's point about attention to the situation. And I want to say we also should always be also attending to our situation. At dinner last night, Kieran and I were talking about how field work and theory building and being in places all has demands on and is contextual and contingent on our bodies to be in those places. Our networks of funding, our children, the genocides that are happening in the world. So I think the appropriateness question and resonances and ways in which we kind of build theory collectively and build our methods collectively are also situated. And I think we're just not talking about those things enough today.
Thank you so much for that. So thank you everybody. Thank you Rohit. Thank you Aparna.